In the past few centuries, we have created things which allow us to travel, build, and yes, kill with greater and greater efficiency. While in many ways these inventions improve our lives, we have always known that there is a cost to progress. The strain these industries have made on our environment is readily apparent, as is the constant fear that with every act of automation, we make our flesh and blood bodies and minds more and more insignificant. Since the Industrial Revolution began, many myths have arisen to maintain the truth that it is man who makes machines and not the other way around. These tales seek to convince us yet again that it is still humanity and not humanity's inventions that is more important at the end of the day. Our story today comes to us from American folklore. It's a legend which highlights the power and sacrifice of the working man, the strength that hope can give us, and the struggle for relevance between humankind and the technology it creates. I'm Minimus, and welcome to Silver Breath Stories. Today's story is that of John Henry and the Machine. From day one, John Henry seemed destined to be larger than life. He was born in Virginia 2 decades before the American Civil War on a slave plantation. He grew twice as fast as the other children and soon found himself working alongside grown men. John Henry tilled the fields, built barns, and drove off thieves, but never, ever saw a return for any of his labors. He knew this was wrong. From a very early age, John Henry realized that there had to be more to life than the constant petty tyranny of the slave plantation. In his few short years in the American South, he had seen his fellow man whipped and beaten, condescended towards as if they were mules or dogs, and worst of all, he'd seen lovers and families separated by the scratch of the master's pen. So, when a teenage John heard the news of war, a war that had the potential to destroy slavery, he wasted no time. One night, John escaped the plantation and fled north to freedom. As soon as he could, he set out to enlist in the Union Army. At just 15, he stood an axe handle above any of the soldiers enlisting in the same cause. Though many black soldiers would later fight and die heroically for the Union, John was not destined to fill the role of the warrior. Despite his imposing form and incredible strength, or perhaps because of it, John was chosen for a very different occupation within the Union Army. His job began long after the battles were over, when he and other workers like him were tasked with removing the dead from the battlefield. They buried the men, black and white, blue and gray, in simple and usually unadorned graves. The physical aspect of this task took little effort from John, but the emotional cost proved far more demanding. Back home in Virginia, he had always been a large and powerful man, for whom little could provoke fear or threaten his sense of confidence. Even the master's bullwhip did little to unsettle him. However, his experience on the gloomy battlefields of the South made him realize that death was something even he was not immune to. As the war dragged on and John grew up with it, he found himself more and more acquainted with death. By war's end, he felt it had become his companion, even a friend, and when that first Juneteenth came and slavery was made illegal, he returned to his native Virginia, knowing he wanted to make the most of his mortal life. Like many, John discovered that one of the best ways to do this was with love. He courted and married another former slave by the name of Polly Ann. Polly Ann was a beautiful and strong woman. She brought out the best in John Henry, including a son, also named John. As a wedding gift, Polly Ann forged for her husband a hammer from tools gathered together from the old plantations. Finally, the steel could reap reward for those that actually labored with it. The hammer soon became John's prized possession. Hoping to make use of it, and knowing that he had to provide for his new family, John moved to the mountains of West Virginia and got a job as a railway worker. The Railway Work Party was a mix of many people, black and white, native-born and immigrant. Though they came from very different backgrounds, they were united in their common goal: lay a railroad track from one side of the Allegheny Mountains to the other. If they did that, they were promised a plot of land on the other side. For men who had spent most of their life on a slaver's plantation or sharecropping farm or in impoverished Ireland, the idea of having land to call their own amounted to an almost biblical promise. John Henry became the unofficial leader of this band of workers. Not only did the sight of his impressive frame have an effect on the group, but his kindness to the other men and their families created a combination of strength and charity that won him over to even the most prejudiced members of the party. He was certainly the fastest steel driver of the lot, and the other men began to tell stories about what else his strength could accomplish. Some said that he had the blood of African kings in his veins, and that this power would allow him to fell a tree with his fists or leap over mountains in a single bound. To them, he was a modern-day Hercules or Samson, pounding the railroad track into submission and opening up the West before their eyes. Working on the railroad was a hard and grueling job, one that reduced the men to little more than motorized meat, but it was made tolerable by the presence of John Henry. The men knew that if anyone could help them hammer their way through the Alleghenies, it was him. Their hope for a fresh start, for open space and land to call their own, for freedom, rested on his shoulders. One day, though, that hope was threatened. The work party's boss, a man by the name of Cornelius Flint, came to the group and announced that there had been a change in plans. The company had decided that there was a better and cheaper way to lay track, a new machine which did the work of 20 men. Flint informed the men that they and their hammers would no longer be needed, and therefore the land on the other side of the mountains would become a company-owned lumber yard. This caused uproar among the workers. They had already worked for 2 long years laying track for the company. They had poured gallons of blood, sweat, and tears into its creation, on the chance to create a new life for their families. Flint was unrelenting, though, and claimed it was someone further up the line who had made the call. He was not the one to blame. This obvious attempt to pass the buck further infuriated the work party, and one of the workers grew so angry he lifted up his hammer and snuck up behind the boss. A strong hand intervened and grabbed the tool from him mid-swing. The worker turned to see John Henry now wielding twin hammers, his great brow furrowed. John Henry approached Flint and in a booming voice that all present could feel in their bones, offered him a deal. "Tomorrow," he said, "you bring this machine, and if it can drive steel faster than John Henry, we'll all go home." Then he lifted his hand and with a finger as thick as a tree branch, pointed towards a nearby rise in the mountain range. "But if I can get through that mountain before the machine, we keep our jobs, and you give us the land on the other side that we were promised." Luckily enough for John and his friends, Cornelius was a betting man. He stroked his beard for a moment of glee and then stuck out his hand. "Deal," he said. That night, John Henry went home to Polly Ann and his son. When he told her what he had agreed to do for his fellow workers, Polly Ann began to weep. What could one man do against a machine? It could destroy him. John held his wife close and simply said, "If it means a new life for you and John, I ain't afraid to die." He'd seen countless men in blue fall on the battlefield so that he and his family could be free. Now, he was ready to lay down his life if it meant hope for his family and his friends. The next day, the work party anxiously awaited the beginning of the contest. Some smoked their pipes nervously, and others sang spirituals and work songs and ballads. John just stood there, with a hammer in hand, looking as far as he could over the Alleghenies. Suddenly, the men's songs were cut short by a harsh, industrial scream. They turned to see the infamous machine approaching, a mad collection of gears and wheels bursting with acrid smoke. Piloting the machine was Flint himself, grinning as he marched it closer and closer to where John stood waiting with his hammer. John Henry could feel the coal-fired heat radiating off the machine as it sputtered and popped next to him. Cornelius Flint leaned out of the cockpit and offered him one more chance to back out. "You country folk don't know what's been going on in the world, John. This new machine can cut through those mountains like a hot knife through butter. You sure you don't want to just go home to your wife?" John replied, "I couldn't do that, sir. Not with my head held high. I promised her a new life on the other side of those mountains, and a man doesn't go back on his promises." Now he looked at Flint pointedly. "No matter what it does for him." Cornelius scrunched his face and pulled down a pair of scarlet goggles over his eyes. "Well then, ready when you are." A member of the crew approached with a revolver. John steeled his body and hoisted his hammer above his head. Meanwhile, Flint's machine whirred and let out another plume of smoke as he threw it into gear. An age seemed to pass before the workman fired a shot in the air, and the battle began between John Henry and the machine. The machine lurched forward violently, pounding spike after spike into the track with ease. Even Henry was surprised by the efficiency of the smoke-billowing engine, but the renewed singing of his friends helped him pick up the pace. The massive body with muscles as hard as steel was completely flung into this task. With every swing of his hammer, he steadily gained ground on the machine. When the two contestants finally came to the mountainside itself, they both paused. Flint looked over at John, half in awe and half in fear. Could he actually lose the wager? John took a moment to collect himself, and then thought of what was awaiting him on the other side. With a new mighty swing of his hammer, he busted the first chunk of rock from the cliffside. The machine countered, firing up a torch and drill and burrowing deep and deep into the rock. John's hammer cracked through stone like thunder and lightning, while the machine plowed in the mountainside with fire and brimstone. Hours passed as the two made their way through the mountain. Pollyanna and her son had joined the work party at this time, and together the group made its way to the other side of the mountain. Pollyanna pressed her ear to the rock and heard the clang of steel against stone. Was it her husband's hammer that she was hearing? Or could it be the drill of the machine? She stepped back as the sound grew less distant, and suddenly a crack split from the side of the mountain. One of the men jumped in and scooped up Little John to protect him as a small avalanche eroded the side of the mountain. As the tunnel opened up, they all caught sight of a giant man, hammer in his hand and chest heaving. It was John Henry. Somewhere along the way, Flint had got the machine stuck in the tunnel and was forced to limp back through the other side. Pollyanna and the work crew rushed toward John to congratulate him on his feat. But as Polly wrapped her arms around John, she suddenly felt his strength give way. Her man, who had gotten by so many years on his incredible strength, now felt limp in her arms. Tears beginning to well up in her eyes, she realized that John was dying. She lay her husband down on the grass. The sun was setting behind them, over another ridge of the Allegheny Mountains. John gently caressed Polly's face with a massive hand. In his other, he still gripped his hammer tightly. "It won't be easy, Polly, not for folks like us. But with a little bit of land to call our own, and hope for you and little John, I could finally lay my hammer down." With those final words, his grip loosened on his legendary hammer, and John Henry died. The steel of the hammer remembered how it had been used to further the profits of slavers. Now it too could rest easy, knowing that it had done the work of a hero. The next day, the men of John Henry's work crew returned to the scene of the great contest, began laying track through the tunnel that their hero had made. It wasn't long after they had started swinging their hammers that they received a surprise visitor. It was Polly Ann, dressed in blue overalls and with John Henry's hammer in her hand. Next to her was Little John. She told the crew that she and her son would help them make the rest of the way through the Allegheny Mountains. And so, as they worked, they began singing a new song, carried beat by the ringing of the hammers. It told the story of a New World Hercules, a man who had beaten a machine through the rock and stone of the Appalachians. The story of John Henry. Its first words were these: John Henry was a little baby, sitting on his papa's knee. He picked up his hammer and a little piece of steel, said, "Hammer's gonna be the death of me. Lord, Lord, hammer's gonna be the death of me." I hope you enjoyed our retelling of the legend of John Henry versus the machine. Even today, a statue of the steel driver stands at the entrance of the Big Bend Tunnel in West Virginia. What you've heard in this video is an interpretation of the legend of John Henry, the larger-than-life figure passed down in music and folklore. If you'd like to learn more about the historical John Henry, or the man who likely inspired the first ballads, I'd recommend you check out Scott Nelson's book, Steel Driving Man John Henry. Please remember to like and share this video, and to subscribe to Silver Breath Stories for new readings like these at the first of each month. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you in the next story.